By contrast, China is located in the center of the action. And, as anyone who works in Washington understands, proximity to power is a power unto itself. Being so close to the battlefield also enables China to implement an anti-access/area denial, A2/AD, strategy by using its territory to deploy large amounts of missiles, aircraft, surveillance systems and radar. In effect, these are unsinkable aircraft carriers. Other ways that US and Chinese defense budgets fail to capture the real balance of power in Asia are less well known. One factor that many observers overlook is personnel costs. Despite having a large military, China's military spends far less than the United States on personnel. And, once personnel costs are taken into account, the gap between US and Chinese military spending is less than the raw budget numbers suggest. America rightly takes care of the men and women who serve in the armed services. The costs of doing so, however, are astronomical. According to the Pentagon's own estimates, nearly half of the entire defense budget is consumed by military and civilian personnel costs. Half of the FY 2015 budget would equal out to about $298.5 billion. In other words, the Pentagon spends more on personnel than any other country, including China, spends on its entire military. Indeed, the US military's personnel costs are more than the combined defense budgets of all other NATO members. China's military is less transparent, making it harder to accurately gauge how much it spends on personnel. However, most experts believe that personnel costs consume about 1/3 of the People's Liberation Army's (PLA) budget. By that figure, China's military spent about $48.6 billion on personnel costs in 2015. The discrepancy in personnel costs between China and the United States is even greater when one considers them on a per-soldier basis. The PLA is estimated to have a total of 2.3 million people in active service, compared to just 1.4 million for the US Armed Services. That means China spends just over $21,000 per active duty member of their military. The comparable figure for the United States is more than $214,000. The impact this has on each country's respective military budget is staggering. When personnel costs are removed from the US side, military spending decreases from $597 billion to $298 billion. By comparison, China's military spending drops from $145.8 billion to $97.2 billion. In other words, when personnel costs are taken out of the equation, China's military spending goes from about a quarter of America's to nearly a third. Labor costs work in China's favor in other ways as well. For instance, the PLA's procurement costs are lowered by the fact
developing the tools it needs if war with America did ever come to pass. Beijing's motto these days: be prepared. The challenges China would face against the US in a conflict, but in a very broad, top-down, and practical sort of way. While Beijing certainly has the tools to get the job done when it comes to a war with Washington, the challenges China would face in such a conflict would be immense, and many of them could be quite basic. The PRC would be going to war against the premier military power on the planet, some would argue the most lethal fighting machine of all time. In this essay we will review some of the important foundational reasons why many argue, quite convincingly, that the US would very well defeat China in a war. Yes, Beijing keeps cranking out those whiz-bang high-tech weapons of war like sausages. China has those shiny, new carrier killer missiles that everyone is always fretting about, including yours truly. It's building aircraft carriers, fifth-generation fighters, multiple types of cruise missiles, nuclear and ultra-quiet diesel submarines, drones, mines and so on. It all looks really good, at least on paper. When it comes to a war with the US, how well would Beijing be able to use all that stuff? The real question seems pretty simple. Yes, China is certainly developing all the military and technology goodies to field a potent force. However, how well can it operate all that equipment in the pressure-filled situation of a war? Sure, Beijing is certainly developing a world-class military, but can its soldiers operate all that equipment competently? Just how well trained are they? You can have the best military in the world, but if you don't know how to use it, well, you get the idea. So how much would the above impact the much-needed rapid reaction time essential to make quick decisions once the bombs begin to drop in a war with America? Is China up to the challenge? The idea of the PLA being a party army is a very important reality. What does this all mean in a war with America? Your guess is as good as mine. There is no better way to make a modern military even more deadly than to fight jointly. Sharing intelligence and waging war by coordinating your forces across multiple domains, think air, sea, space, cyber and land, is the best way to achieve hard-fought military objectives and is the ultimate force multiplier. It is something America and many other great powers are putting a lot of time, energy and resources into. China is also working towards such a goal. And while sources vary on how well Beijing could wage a major joint operation against a determined foe, especially against the US, many have their doubts. In a recent report by the RAND Corporation titled China's Incomplete Military Modernization, the authors have some serious doubts when it comes to Beijing's joint warfighting capabilities. Many Chinese strategists identify the inability to conduct integrated joint operations at the desired level of competence as the central problem China faces as it aspires to project combat power beyond its land borders. Indeed, Chinese sources highlight several problems that contribute to the PLA's shortcomings in the area of joint operations and suggest that there is still a large gap between China and developed countries' militaries, especially the United States. In the same paragraph, the authors of the study also discuss issues with training, reinforcing my earlier point. PLA publications also highlight continuing shortfalls in training, despite years of effort to make training more realistic and more valuable in terms of addressing shortcomings and improving the PLA's operational capabilities. In addition, the publications point to persistent challenges in combat support and combat service support functions and forces, as reflected by frequent discussions of shortcomings in logistics and maintenance capabilities that appear in PLA newspaper reports and journal articles. When it comes to military technology, keeping ahead of the curve is key. America seems to crank out new defense tech all the time. The question over the long term for China will be how well it can keep up in the tech game. Specifically, can Beijing develop advanced military systems indigenously? This might be the biggest challenge for China when we look out over the long term, 10 to 20 years in the future, in a conflict with America. We all know China has a great track record of, well, permanently borrowing the design
their spy ships to track the Carl Vinson and its accompanying escort ships is also a sign that the Chinese and the Russians are working together during this crisis, not just at the diplomatic level but at the level of their militaries as well. It also reinforces the long-held impression that there is a secret agreement for intelligence sharing between them. However, the joint decision to dispatch spy ships to shadow the Carl Vinson and the rest of the US fleet would be a political one agreed by the two countries' presidents, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. President Trump's National Security Advisor General McMaster has again said that China is working with the US on a range of options to solve the Korean crisis. The dispatch of Chinese spy ships to the area alongside Russia's is however the only practical action China has so far taken during this crisis. It suggests cooperation between Beijing and Moscow, not Beijing and Washington. A Chinese conventional first strike against US military forces in Asia is now technically plausible, and backed by China's consistently preemptive naval, missile and cyber doctrines. This gives an incentive to the US to itself strike first, especially if Chinese nuclear retaliation is calculated as unlikely. Such preemptive strikes, by either side, would lead to major power military conflict that would start with multiple nuclear powers, rather than end with one nuclear power as did World War II. It would be the most destructive war in world history, and so military technologies such as China's O-55 destroyer armed with YJ-18 ASCM that upset the balance of power in Asia are profoundly destabilizing and contrary to what one should expect from a status quo power. Such technologies are therefore ultimately counter to China's broader commercial and security interests. According to Fainel, U.S. Navy warship anti-ship cruise missile programs are just now being developed. Fainel said, "And how long will it be before RASM or SM-6 numbers reach the numbers that PRC already has with the YJ-18? We appear to be behind the power curve for what could be a rather long time, just as the PRC begins to consolidate its territorial claims in the maritime domain of the South and East China Seas over the next decade." Fainel has long argued for increased U.S. naval spending. The 055 competes directly with the U.S. Navy's Arleigh Burke-class destroyers and Ticonderoga cruisers, which are the main delivery system for naval surface combatant firepower globally. The Ticonderoga-class cruisers currently have 16 operational ships and 6 undergoing refurbishment at any given time. There are 62 Arleigh Burkes worldwide, and the U.S. Navy is building 14 more. They are smaller and carry less firepower than the 055s. The Arleigh Burke destroyers displace 8,000 to 10,000 tons and have up to 96 VLS launch tubes each. That is a lot of potential firepower. But what debilitates the Arleigh Burke destroyers is their reliance on 8 Harpoon ASM tubes each, the range of which is limited to only 67 nautical miles compared with the YJ-18's 290 nanometers range. Harpoon missiles do not fit into VLS tubes. According to naval analysts, some of the US destroyers in Asia do not even carry their full complement of Harpoon ASMs, and since 1999, the Arleigh Burkes have not had any Harpoon launchers installed. Most US destroyers, therefore, have only token anti-ship capabilities, making them vulnerable to a debilitating first strike in case of war. As senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments Brian Clark noted in testimony to Congress in 2015, the next-generation land attack weapon, which also has an anti-ship function, will not enter U.S. Navy service until 2028 or 2030. Tomahawk cruise missiles, with a range of 1,000 nanometers, are also undergoing modification for an ASCM capability, but are subsonic and therefore more easily targeted. They will not be fielded until 2021, and will likely go out of service in 2040. Until then, and if China's surface fleet has an anti-missile system capable of downing the slow Tomahawk, Navy destroyers and cruisers are uniquely vulnerable to China.
5th, Xi said it was necessary to concentrate preparations for fighting a war, reported the South China Morning Post, citing a transcript of Xi's speech from state broadcaster China Central Television. "We need to take all complex situations into consideration and make emergency plans accordingly." State news wire Xinhua also noted the speech, saying Xi underlined the importance of preparing for war and combat. In recent years, China has increasingly asserted itself in the South China Sea, building militarized islands atop reefs and fortifying other specks of land it occupies. China claims nearly the entire sea, using as justification its 9-dash line, which encircles most of the waterway. An international tribunal invalidated the claim in July 2016, but China disregarded its findings. China has rapidly modernized and expanded its navy, paywall, which last year became the world's largest, with more warships and submarines than the United States. Though the U.S. Navy remains more advanced, Admiral Philip Davidson, who leads the U.S.'s Indo-Pacific Command, said in his Senate confirmation process earlier this year that China is now capable of controlling the South China Sea in all scenarios short of war with the United States. On the same day of Xi's speech, Chinese Defense Minister Wei Feng said his country would not give up one single piece of its territory and warned that repeated challenges to its sovereignty over Taiwan would result in direct military action. Such rhetoric isn't entirely new. In November 2017, 1,000 feet. The warplane is considered by Chinese media as Beijing's answer to MQ-9 Reaper, the most feared military drone in the U.S. Air Force. First unveiled in September last year, Winglong 2 was developed by the Aviation Industry Corporation of China and can be sold to overseas buyers. Propelled by a turbine engine, the jet can carry out scouting and combating missions and carry as many as 14 missiles. It's capable of flying 20 hours without refueling. The plane's chief designer Li Guidong told Xinhua that Winglong 2 could automatically choose an airport and perform emergency landing under unexpected circumstances. The latest edition of Winglong 2, which was featured in People's Daily, is equipped with small AG-300 laser-guided air-to-ground missiles capable of hitting targets 30 to 40 kilometers, 18 to 25 miles, away, said a recent report on Sina Military. Its maximum speed of 370 kilometers an hour means it's one of the fastest unmanned fighter jets in China. The current top speed for unmanned service aircraft in the world is around 480 kilometers, 300 miles, per hour, achieved by the US MQ-9 Reaper drone. However, reported from earlier this year suggested that China had developed a supersonic unmanned fighter jet, called Dark Sword. It was claimed that Dark Sword could fly at 1,190 kilometers, 740 miles, per hour, an unprecedented speed for unmanned military aircraft. Last year, China started mass-produced its largest and most powerful drone bomber CH-5, also known as Rainbow 5. The aircraft can carry 16 missiles and fly up to 60 hours without refueling, reaching a maximum range of 10 km, is the subject of a new article at Aviation Week and Space Technology. PL-20 carries the typical PL designation common to Chinese air-to-air missiles. At 18 feet long, PL-20 is thought to have a range exceeding 100 miles, the typical maximum range of air-to-air missiles. U.S. warplanes need plenty of support to reach their wartime potential. In that way, tankers, command and control aircraft, and reconnaissance planes are the backbone that let fighters operate at long ranges. For example, an AWACS C-3 Sentry can detect enemy aircraft at longer ranges and vector in American fighters flying with their own radars off, a technique that makes them harder to detect. AWACS planes also orchestrate the air battle, directing friendly forces against enemy forces. Airborne refueling tankers dramatically extend the range of short-range fighters such as the F-35. Without these planes, U.S. forces would operate at a severe disadvantage. Stealthy fighter jets would have to fly with their radars constantly on to search for enemies, emitting electromagnetic radiation that enemy forces could use to detect them. Coordination of the air battle would become more difficult and less efficient, controlled by individual pilots already flying their own combat missions. Deprived of the ability to refuel in mid-air, targets deep behind enemy lines would become off-limits and fighters would patrol at shorter ranges. China's new missile most likely would work like this. In a future air battle, a Chengdu J-20 fighter loaded with PL-20 would attempt to fly around U.S. fighters to get behind them and search for a tanker or a AWACS plane. If it finds such a target, the J-20 would launch the missile from long range, then disengage. Even if the missile misses, the danger might force U.S. support aircraft to fly farther behind friendly lines, limiting their effectiveness in general. PL-20 appears similar in concept to the Soviet K-100 missile. Developed by Novator, the K-100 was unique among air-to-air missiles in being a two-stage missile length makes the Chinese railgun similar in size to the BAE 32 megajoule railgun built for U.S. Navy testing. The BAE system is designed to fire 22-pound projectiles at Mach 7 speeds to more than 100 miles. Despite previous efforts to install this multi-megawatt railgun on the USNS Trenton, shifting budget priorities in late 2017 may mean that this railgun may never be carried on a USN warship. The United States had earlier planned to install a railgun prototype on the USNS Trenton fast transport in 2016, but this was postponed for budgetary reasons. In fact, current railgun research funding has been reported as in trouble, as the Pentagon focuses first on equipping conventional naval guns with the railgun's low-drag, high-speed ammunition. China's advancing work in railgun and other electromagnetic technologies shouldn't come as a surprise. In addition to copious open-source research by Chinese scientists, a program led by Rear Admiral Ma Weiming has in the past hired Chinese military engineers to build state-of-the-art electromagnetically assisted launch system catapults for future Chinese aircraft carriers. The program also built integrated electrical propulsion systems to meet the electrical needs of future Chinese warships. And keep in mind, just because the railgun is there doesn't mean the railgun actually works. Engineers for this test, as with all other railgun work, will have to overcome formidable challenges in material durability, power storage, and projectile guidance. If successful, however, it would offer China a game-changing capability. A working railgun would likely be installed on future versions of the Type 055 destroyer, which makes sense considering the vessel has been reported to have IEPs, which would meet the electrical demands of railguns and other direct energy weapons like lasers. In terms of benefits, the railgun's hypersonic long-range projectiles would be perfect for cheaply and quickly knocking out high-threat air targets like ballistic missiles, aircraft, and even future hypersonic vehicles. The long range would also come in handy for missions like anti-ship warfare, supplementing shorter-ranged anti-ship ballistic and cruise missiles. Finally, such long-ranged artillery would be a significant addition to long-range bombardment of ground targets.